Welcome everybody to another Developer Livecast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. For our topic tonight, we're going to be discussing accessibility in the game industry. Ways to make games more accessible to players, both in terms of quality of life standpoints, as well as discussing what it means in terms of designing a game as well. And joining me tonight, he's an expert on accessibility in video games, and he recently worked or helped work on the game Celeste in terms of its much touted assist mode. So please welcome to our stream tonight, Ian Hamilton.
Hello. Oh, sorry, correction. That was a journalist getting the wrong end of the stick. So I didn't work on Celeste. I was just telling people about it.
Okay, no problem. Hey, Ian, how are you doing today?
I'm very good, thanks. Yourself?
I am doing well. For those of you watching this either live or recorded, I'm still recovering from a very nasty cold. So I'm about 89% of the way there, but there's still a possibility of my voice dying during our cast. So we'll see what happens. And thanks for coming on, Ether. You are just in time. But we have a very great cast for you. We had to reschedule this week because Tuesday I was certainly not up for having a lengthy design chat. But we're here tonight, and we're going to be spending about the next hour discussing this. So, to begin with, for people who haven't heard of you or your work, Ian, could you talk a little bit about your background and what do you do in the game industry?
My background, yeah. So before I moved full-time over into accessibility, my background was in design and UX, and kind of started getting into accessibility stuff when I was working on kids games for the BBC. So this was like Teletubbies and that kind of stuff, and saw some playtesting footage of some games that had been adapted to be playable just with a single key press, which meant basically they could be mapped to a button on a wheelchair headrest or a tube to blow into. It's basically Stephen Hawking kind of stuff. And that's what first kind of got me interested in accessibility, was seeing the human benefit that kind of thing had, that a relatively simple design consideration actually made a huge difference to people's lives, which, up to that point, as working as the designer, like a good day's work for me was to be able to affect someone's emotions, give someone some enjoyment, make them think, So actually seeing that games are so much more powerful than that was a big eye-opener for me. So things kind of progressed on from there. Now accessibility is all I do. So I work with all areas of the industry, from studios to trade bodies, government bodies, platforms, publishers, the works. Just really doing anything that I can to raise awareness and raise the bar for inclusion of people with disabilities in games.
And it certainly is a very interesting topic. I think you may have found me, I think I did a post about accessibility or a video, I think it was like a year and a half ago. And that was just us discussing things from, I think I was talking more about things from the UI standpoint. But things have certainly have become a lot more involved these days. And as we said a few minutes ago, when we talk about accessibility, we can refer to things from a quality of life standpoint, as in, again, UI design, features like that, and we talk about things from a design standpoint. And I figure we'll spend time on both for today. So, I guess to begin with, when it comes to ooh, there's that coughing. When it comes to actually defining accessibility for a video game, I guess, what would be like the simplest definition for you, Ian, when you have to go talk to someone about why or what do we mean when we say we're adding accessibility to a specific design or a specific title?
I think to answer that, really you need to get into a bit about what disability itself actually is. And so disability is basically when someone's medical condition comes up against some kind of a barrier, and that then results in difficulty performing some kind of a task. So accessibility is looking at those barriers, identifying which ones of those are unnecessary, and doing what you can to remove them.
And it's one of those topics that I know for a lot of developers, it's not something that I think most people really think about, or at least think about in terms of how their game is approached. And as we said, if we want to talk about things from like the simplest end of the spectrum, we can say things like colorblind mode, subtitles. I know you linked, I think when you first like found my work, I know you linked to I think it was a special interest group on the IGDA that had an
Mhm.
entire list of various disabilities and ways for developers to design around them or design accessibility features to help people who suffer from them.
Yeah, yeah. If you check out gameaccessibilityguidelines.com, then that's got all that kind of stuff on it as well.
Hmm. Now, I guess to start off, I guess on a light topic when it comes to accessibility, and from the work that you've done and talking to developers, are there any like major misconceptions about accessibility in games that kind of like seem to rear their head the most when you talk to people?
Yeah, well, there's a common set of misconceptions, and it's not specific to game development either. It's standard across all industries, and certainly I had all the common misconceptions myself. You know, I wasn't born caring about accessibility. Those usual ones are that accessibility is really difficult, really expensive, that it's going to mean diluting your ideas down to suit a lowest common denominator, that lowest common denominator is less than 1% of the population, and they don't play games anyway. So that's the common set. It's quite common to find people who've got, if not all of them, like some combination of those things. But actually, every single one of them is demonstrably false. They are just that, misconceptions.
Hmm.
So that's part of the stage we're at the moment. We're kind of just about beyond the stage of people not having heard of accessibility. It's becoming less and less common to meet people who've never thought about disability before, but there's still quite a bit of those misconceptions around.
Hmm. Now, I guess here's a question for you, I guess, regarding those misconceptions. When it comes to, like, when we're talking about, again, like, basic accessibility options, like, the people in the chat are talking about, like, colorblind mode, subtitles, stuff like that. Are
Yeah.
those options relatively easy to implement in a game? Like, if someone, like, let's say we're 75% done developing a game and someone says, hey, let's put in, or we don't have a colorblind mode, or we don't have subtitles, or
Yeah.
is that kind of stuff relatively easy to do once you decide to set out and do it?
Well, that's a slightly loaded question, but the important thing about what you said though is the 75%, because the vast majority of accessibility stuff, the difficulty and expense that's involved in doing it is directly related to the point at which you consider it in the development of a game.
Hmm.
So if you're at 75%, then a lot of things
It's
are going
go-
to be quite challenging.
yeah.
Um, the point really to start thinking about it is before you hit 0%,
Hmm.
like before you even write a single line of code. If you can be thinking about the kind of barriers that people might come up against in your mechanic, you can actually address things early on just through simple design decisions.
Hmm.
So classic example of that would be text size.
Yeah.
So tiny text
Oh,
is
yes.
one of the top most complained about things in games, especially now more and more so with the ever increasing resolutions and assumptions about people's TV sizes and that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And if you are thinking about text size from the very outset, if you, for example, decide that you are never going to have any text beneath 28 pixels, that costs nothing. It's just a design decision. If late in development you decide you're going to change all of your text from 14 pixels to 28 pixels, that is a really big, difficult piece of work. That it can be big and difficult enough that it just won't get done.
Yeah.
There is a game actually that all credit to them did actually go in and try and patch text size immediately after launch, which is on the Witcher 3. All credit to them for going in and doing it. It's not an easy thing to try and retrofit at all, and they're quite limited in what they're able to do. There's only certain aspects of the interface that were flexible enough to be able to offer a change in text size. But that's a nice example. I mean, hopefully in the next Witcher game or spin-off, whatever it comes to, now that they're aware of that issue, they'll be able to tackle it much earlier in development and be able to do it much easier, much cheaper, and much more effectively as well.
Hmm. And I remember the game Banjo and Kazooie Nuts and Bolts for the 360 that I think Rare also released a text UI patch for that game after release to expand the text of that. Because as you said, Ian, with the changing of resolutions, I know for the 360 in particular, when I was playing games on there, I was using a standard definition TV at the time. and that text was micro. I mean, I like I said, I have good vision, but I could barely read any of the text that was on a lot of those games.
Yeah, yeah, it's still happening. I've got my vision is fine, and I've had the first experience now of having to give up on a game because of the text size. That was on Mass Effect Andromeda. So there was the demo of that. I downloaded the demo. Loved all the other Mass Effect games. Maybe with the exception of the ending of 3. But anyway, that's topic for a different day.
Yeah.
But love the Mass Effect games. Really excited about Andromeda. Got the demo, and it was just such a pain to play it. Just there's nothing that breaks your immersion more than just having to forget about the game and concentrate and peer and try and figure out what the text is trying to say. So that's as far as I got. I never bought the game, so that's one sale at least they lost from what really could have been addressed quite easily if it was thought about early enough in development.
Yeah, and I'm going to assume that you don't agree with this point, Ian, but it sounds like to improve accessibility in a lot of games that this really does go hand in hand with getting a stable play testing done with your game as early as possible as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, basically, this isn't something specific to game development. It's the same across all industries, which is that basically you've got 3 pillars of accessibility. You've got working into guidelines, like the ones that you mentioned earlier. Also getting some expert advice if you've got some tricky problems to solve. And the third one is just getting it in front of people with disabilities and just watching how people get on with it. And basically each one of those 3 pillars has got its own kind of pros and cons. But if you can combine all 3 of them, then you can do the best possible job of making it as enjoyable as possible for as many people as possible. So yeah, that's absolutely vital, getting people involved, and it can go beyond play tests and user research as well. Even just something as simple as, like, if you've got like an alpha test, just have a question in it asking about accessibility. If you've got forums, have a question on there asking about accessibility, because you often find that people are not entirely comfortable, especially given some of the experiences they may have had in years gone by when people were a bit less accepting of accessibility. So you really need to make efforts to make sure that people feel comfortable giving that kind of input about barriers they might be facing, and making them feel that their feedback is welcome and wanted.
Oh yeah, definitely. And keeping with coming up with these different accessibilities or using playtesting, I guess here's a question for you, Ian. And again, going back to kind of the general misconceptions revolving accessibility features. At this point, when we talk about video games, is there, like, I guess, a quote-unquote standard feature or a standard feature list of accessibility options that games, like any game, should typically have at this point?
It's tough. Because basically it comes for other industries, you can have that. Like if you're building a building, there's basic requirements that buildings have to meet. If you're building a website, same thing again. There's like 50 requirements. You meet them, and then that is what's regarded as a reasonable bar of accessibility for any website. The same thing doesn't really exist in games, because games are intentionally inaccessible. If they weren't in some way inaccessible, they wouldn't be a game anymore. It's a core part of what makes games enjoyable, and the intentional required inaccessibility in a game varies from game to game. So what's appropriate to consider also varies from game to game. So for example, like if you are making a website, then a common consideration is to avoid any reliance on precise timing. If you're making a chess game, if you're making Civilization, fair enough, absolutely, that's a real basic, really reasonable, simple thing to aim for. If you're making a first-person shooter or a racing game, not so much. So it varies by mechanic and varies by specific game as well. So there isn't really a huge amount that can apply across every single game. There are kind of, I guess there's a few that would rarely have exceptions. One of them is not using tiny text. Another one is subtitles. Another one is button remapping.
Oh, yes.
And that's a really, really important one. For accessibility in particular, and it's important for everyone, just if you might disagree with the designer's interesting choice of button layout. But if, for example, you can't physically reach your fingers around to pull the triggers and shoot or accelerators on one of the triggers, then you having the ability to move that function off that button onto somewhere you can actually reach is the difference between being able to play and not being able to play.
Yeah, and button remapping, that one to me, I think that that should be definitely on like a standard list of features for a lot of video games, just for the amount of quality of life that can improve to a game. Ooh, hold on one second. There you go, my voice. But like, I'm still surprised today that we see games that don't allow for button remapping, because that to me is just such a core feature for making it easier for your game to play. As you said, Ian, just because like one person can fit your game doesn't mean that someone else can get their hand like that crazy configuration. As a really interesting case in point, people were talking about the Monster Hunter series and how for the PSP and the handheld versions, there are these crazy like hand gestures. You had to like manipulate your hand around to try and play that, because you had to use the left analog stick while holding one button down to manipulate the camera, while holding another button down to attack. And like people were making fun of that, and it was actually causing a lot of people pain to play that game. To give you another example, the game Kid Icarus Uprising for the 3DS, that game was horrible if you were a lefty. Just due to how the 3DS was designed, that you only had the one real analog stick on the left-hand side. So you had to really get some crazy configuration going with your hands to play that game, unless you wanted to buy their additional add-on for the 3DS for that.
Yep. Well, you find it a lot that actually, I would go further than a lot. I'd say it's actually rare to find accessibility features that are only useful for people with disabilities, because generally what you find is that something that is a real exclusionary barrier for one person is still a bit of an annoyance for everyone else. So you often find that it's just a matter of good game design. It just so happens that there is one particular group who finds that a bit even more useful than everyone else.
Yeah. And I want to harp on what we were talking about a few minutes ago with the importance of playtesting, because we've brought this up many times on these casts and on our record talks, but it still needs to be said that you want to get your game in front of as many people as possible. Sorry, I'm down here myself again. There you go. You want to get your game in front of as many people as possible as early on, so you can see where there are those pain points and those inaccessible options or inaccessible features of your game.
Yeah, so a game that would have benefited from that, I'm just replying to Mr. No Life in the comments, would have been Doom. So he's got the comment there that Doom's got 3 different colorblind modes. It actually doesn't. Doom actually has 3 different colorblind simulators, which is really unfortunate to see. It basically looks like someone has looked up colorblind algorithms, found some algorithms and implemented them, not realizing that they're actually simulation algorithms rather than correction algorithms. So if you put on G2 mode, which is a type of red-green colorblindness, that doesn't correct it. It just shows you what it would look like if you had it. So if you're red-green colorblind, it makes no difference at all to the game. So that's unfortunate, and that's a good example of something that might have been possible to avoid if there had been a bit more testing. I mean, I can't say that for definite. I don't have any insight into what testing was involved in it, but the end result was unfortunate.
Yeah, and as we said earlier in the Cassie, and there's definitely still that misconception about accessibility in games that it's going to, like, put a drain on developers' resources, or it's going to balloon a game's development out. And it can be very hard, I think, for a lot of people to get behind additional development on a game. And we'll be talking more about what that means for challenging games in a few minutes. Actually, I want to do a quick time check. Yeah, we're about 20 minutes in. We're going to try to keep this to about an hour. So hopefully we won't be here all night long. But one of the more interesting aspects when we talk about accessibility is moving from just talking about things from a disability standpoint, again, subtitles, colorblind, etc., and talking about things internally in the game. So we're talking about quality of life features within the title, or changing or impacting the game design itself to make it more accessible. And this is when things get a lot more trickier, because as we said a few minutes ago, there usually is not a standard checklist for what makes a game accessible, because every game is different. I mean, there's a very big difference between someone playing Doom 2016 and someone playing Civilization 6 or League of Legends or again, we can name games for the next hour. So, for you, Ian, and the work that you've done with accessibility, when we start talking about things from within the game's design itself, be it UI, quality of life, or just the mechanics in general, where does accessibility come in at that point?
Well, I'll go back a little bit and answer a bit about what you said earlier about the costs as well. Because part of it is there's kind of three sides to it. One is if you think about it early, there's a lot of stuff that can be really, really cheap or even free. The second side of it is that often it's stuff that isn't niche at all. It's stuff that benefits all players. So a nice example of that, which kind of ties in a bit with the game design question as well, is a game called Way of the Passive Fist. Do you know that one?
One of my fans was telling me about it last week, but I haven't had a chance to check it out.
Yep. Yeah, so that's launching imminently, and it's basically like an old school Final Fight Streets of Rage type brawler, set on like a really hot desert planet where it's really easy to get exhausted. So the combat is actually all blocking, and you just sit there blocking everyone, wait for them to get tired out, and then knock them out with a single punch. But they thought about accessibility from the very outset, and one of the things they hit upon from considering both motor accessibility and cognitive accessibility, people who might need a bit more time to process things or might not have as fast reactions, was actually breaking down, instead of the usual like easy, medium, difficult, breaking it down kind of in the same way that sport games do, into a few of those constituent variables that make up the difficulty. So you've got like any speed and frequency of pickups and stuff like that, and actually allow people to configure their difficulty level. And like I said, that's something that came about through considering accessibility for some fairly niche groups, but actually that's something that players in general have really, really loved, being able to have that fine detail control over their experience. So that's kind of the second side, that often it can actually be things that the actual cost you're putting in, the return on that is actually beneficial for all players. It's just part of game design rather than an extra bolt-on cost. The last thing is actually, even if you, I suppose the two things balanced, that even if you are thinking about late in development, there's still a lot that you can do that can be really beneficial. So Uncharted 4 is a game that a lot of people know about the accessibility functionality in. That is, it's got some really nice stuff for basically one-handed play. So you can turn on a bunch of assists so that aiming and shooting basically works in the same way as Grand Theft Auto. So you can point in someone's direction, hit the lock-on button, and it'll aim at them. There's also an option to have automatic camera movement as well. So going back to the old like single stick console days of it moving around the camera automatically for you. Basically, you combine those things together, you only need one hand to play. And that feature set was put in right very, very end of development, and it didn't take a lot of time and money at all to implement it. And the number of people in the general population who only have one hand is slightly under 1% of the population. The percent of Uncharted 4's players who use those features is 30%. So that's millions of players benefiting from those features for a really, really small cost. So I think, yeah, between those three things, that's kind of the three angles on the cost side of it.
Now, I guess I'm not sure this will be a complete tangent, but one thing I'm curious about, Ian, I know from like looking at the stuff that from places you've linked to and some of the topics discussed that there are specially designed controllers for people with disabilities, and I don't know the names off the top of my head. I'm sure you probably know more than I do about this, but in terms of designing a game to be compatible with those specific controllers, is there a lot of work that goes into that, or is it relatively easy to make those controllers compatible for certain types of games?
It's easy. It's actually the other way around. So rather than the games being made to be compatible with the controllers are made to be compatible with the games. It's like the story I mentioned at the start about those kids games that were adapted to work with a single key press. So those games weren't designed to be compatible with somebody blowing into a tube. Somebody blowing into a tube is designed to be compatible with somebody pressing a key. So they're actually designed to be compatible with regular controllers. So like if you're making a game that is suited for mouse control, that makes it suited for eye gaze as well. So there are some considerations you can make, but it's really more often about general game design decisions. So making sure that you have remapping, making sure that your controls are unnecessarily complex. Anything you can do for like reaction speed and all that kind of stuff, it's really not so much about having to design specifically for controllers, which makes it a hell of a lot easier for game designers.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting back to within the game space itself, especially with UI and quality of life features. Now, again, we can easily link this back to playtesting. I know, again, we've talked about this before, but when it comes to like looking at a video game, like in terms of its UI and quality of life, are there any major red flags or areas that you see that designers typically tend to struggle with when it comes to making these aspects accessible to new players or just accessible to anyone trying to play these games?
I'm not sure really. Things people struggle with. I guess something that people struggle with conceptually is multiplayer.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of comes from the kind of misconception that it's about diluting down and making things easier. But there's actually a lot you can do. I mean, there are some restrictions in multiplayer. Obviously, it still has to be a level playing field. But there's a few different angles on it. One of them is features that don't have any impact at all on different people's experience. So something like color blindness, something like remapping, you know. The second side of it is features that are basically designed to make it easier for people to come in at the bottom without giving any kind of competitive advantage to people at the top. So like aim assist. So aim assist for someone who, for whatever reason, doesn't have very accurate aiming, can be really helpful at avoiding them just coming way at the bottom every time and having a miserable experience. But aim assist is no good for people at the top because aim assist only takes you up to a certain level.
Yeah.
It's not as efficient and accurate as doing manual aiming. So there's that kind of side of it as well. Then the last side of it is matchmaking preferences. So if you got, so for example, a feature like voice chat, which is obviously really, really essential for some people, they can't play without it. Also is completely inaccessible for some people as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're deaf, if you've got problems speaking. So what do you do if you've got those two competing sets of requirements? We'll just let people choose. Like in Halo Reach, and I think in Grand Theft Auto Online as well, games actually that you just choose whether you want to play with other people who've got the same communications preferences as you.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to touch back on what you just said regarding aim assist in first-person shooters, because I actually brought up a very interesting topic from last year with the fighting game community, and that was with the idea of having quote-unquote simple combos. This was something that was seen in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Infinite. I think that was the game that had it, where you could turn on this mode, and what it would do is it would greatly reduce the button string combos and the requirement on the player to perform various multi-hit combos for their characters. And this is again in stark contrast to traditional fighting games where you can have 10 to 15 button press combos, combinations to do a combo. And fighting game experts were arguing about this, saying that it was dumbing things down. It was reducing the skill curve needed to play these games competitively. But I think, as you just said, Ian, when it comes to with aim assist, it does more to help the bottom than it does to lower the top. That if you have someone who can actually master those combos, I think they're still going to be a lot better than someone who can only play the game using the simple combo buttons. But it does allow those people to actually get into these games more, in my opinion. So I was just wondering, what did you think about that and that whole little, I guess, minor debate that happened?
Well, the important thing to bear in mind is that it's an option.
Mm-hmm.
I can see there's some mentions in the comments of games where it isn't an option even, but it should just be an option. If somebody wants to play with those combos on, then why not let them?
Mm-hmm.
it's I think important to abstract out a little bit what actually you want from the game.
Hmm.
And if what you want from the game is people to have that satisfaction of mastering, being able to push their motor skills to the limit and do the most difficult combo they can do, for some people that is going to be a really simple combo. There are different people who've got different skill ceilings. So I think that's something that's always worth bearing in mind when you're talking about different levels, different options, is that it's not so much about dumbing down the experience and worsening the experience. It's actually more about allowing more people to have the same kind of experience,
Yeah.
because the experience is relative to their abilities, right? But at the same time, it's like I said, it's an option. So if some people want to play with that, great. If some people don't, great. If you're playing at a tournament level, then make a rule that people can't play with it turned on. You know?
Yeah, but I think you had a really good point there about it being an option and something to help, excuse me, more people play these games. Because for me, I've said this before, I am horrible when it comes to memorizing button combos for fighting games. It doesn't work for me. So any game that has those crazy combinations, I'm going to be at an innate disadvantage. It was one of the reasons why I was so interested in checking out the game For Honor, which tried to remove a lot of that complexity. And as you said, as we've talked about before, it really comes down to what kind of experience you want your game to represent. Or we can even drill down further and say, what does it mean to master this game? Or what does it mean to play this game at an expert level? And for some games, it is about that, hardcore memorization. For StarCraft, for instance, high-level StarCraft plays, of course, super micro-intensive keyboard pressing and being able to do all that within seconds. And it can be very tough sometimes to separate, what's the quote-unquote gamer tax versus what's the actual gameplay or the actual decision-making that goes into playing these titles.
Yeah, and that's what needs to come down to the developer's vision for the game.
Yes.
Which makes it an interesting field to work in, accessibility and game development, compared to other industries, because other industries you don't really have that. It comes back to that thing about the necessary versus the unnecessary barriers again. That's the concept that's quite unique to game development. And it means that in every game, the approach to accessibility has to be a design process of figuring out exactly what it is that you want your players to experience. And that isn't just like a step by step of like this is going to happen and this is going to happen. Everyone. That's one of the beauties of games, is that everybody's experience is unique. So you just need to let go a little bit and be a bit open to the idea that different people are going to have different experiences with your game regardless. So what can you do to avoid those barriers that prevent your vision getting across to them?
Yeah, and again, it's always that fun or nightmares part of game design, that every game has its own unique challenges and its own unique situations. And I think that is probably a really good segue into this next part. And that is talking about what does it mean to have accessibility in challenging games. And I saved this part for last because I think this could easily balloon into an hour or 2 hour discussion if we're not careful again. Because whenever we talk about accessibility in video games, there is a very popular counterpoint that comes up. And it's one that we've talked about many times here on these live casts, as well as these recorded discussions. And that is, what does it mean when the game is meant to be inherently challenging? And for those of you watching this live or recorded now, I'm sure you all are about to guess what game we're about to bring up. And that is, of course, the Soulsborne series. Dark Souls, Demon Souls, Bloodborne, the like. These are games that, when there was actually an entire argument when people asked to have an easy mode in these titles, way back when, and it was like a year and a half, 2 years ago, right around Dark Souls 3. And a lot of people were arguing against that. I think even I made a post about it. But the challenge comes into play with, how do you think about accessibility, or can you think about accessibility in the same breath that you're saying, I am designing this hardcore dungeon crawler, a game that you must be at a certain skill level or you're not being it. There's not going to be a level skip or a boss skip in these games. So I guess I know. I'm sure you got a lot of ideas buzzing in your head right now, Ian. So, what do you say, or what are your thoughts on accessibility in one hand, but super challenging or brutal difficulty in the other?
Yep. Well, part of it comes down to how you open with it. Talking about challenging games, every game is challenging. That's the definition of a game. If you remove the challenge from it, it wouldn't be a game. You'd be left with an interactive narrative or a toy, something like that. So I think that's something that's always worth bearing in mind. It's not about games that are challenging and games that are not. All games are challenging, and every game has thousands of barriers in it. Most of the barriers in a game are unintentional as well. So it's not about you've got this grand vision of this one challenge to overcome. There's actually loads and loads of challenges.
Yes.
And it's about working out, again, what precisely your vision is, what you want your players to experience. And challenging isn't really a vision, it's about specific aspects of challenge. And when it comes to games like Dark Souls, games like Super Meat Boy, games like Cuphead, games like VVVVVVVV, those games that people assume that those games are intended to have, as you said, a skill bar, that they're supposed to be exclusionarily difficult. And that is not the case. I picked those list of games because every single one of those games, they've gone on record in interviews saying that's actually not their vision at all. What they're actually after is something a little bit different. So I am going to, that's what I was tapping when trying to get up, read you a little quote from the designer on Dark Souls. So from the interview he gave, the interviewer asked, "Who do you see as the primary audience for your games? Are you actively trying to encourage more casual gamers to challenge themselves with more taxing games? Or are you happy only to appeal to the hardcore?" And he replied with, "I don't necessarily think I've been educating the wider audience about playing relatively high difficulty level games. The basic approach is to let players experience a sense of accomplishment through overcoming difficulties. And setting a relatively higher difficulty level is actually only one of the answers to meet that goal. So there could be an alternative in order to let players experience a sense of accomplishment. And once I find out, there could be a chance that I pursue another solution instead of providing the high difficulty level." So that's straight from the horse's mouth. And like I said, in all those games, the designers have said similar things, that it's really not about making an exclusionarily difficult game. It's about that same kind of thing of persistence and practice and trial and error, which is a very, very difficult thing to it just being difficult. Then you see that in all of those games that make considerations. I'd say probably Cuphead in the least effective way, with its easy mode. It wasn't called easy mode; it's called something else.
Casual,
that was
simple mode, I think.
Simple mode, yeah, that sounds more like it. That wasn't so great. Better approach to Super Meat Boy. Super Meat Boy put a ton of time and consideration into trying to avoid people being excluded from it. They didn't want people to fail. They wanted everybody to succeed, but to succeed after lots of practice and learning, trial and error. You can see that through stuff like the fact that you can just instantly start again as soon as you die. You see that through being able to look at the replays to learn from your experiences. So see, that's the kind of thing that people are actually going for, and that's the way you really need to look at the vision for these games. Because really, if your vision is for if you want to make a game for people who enjoy that feeling of succeeding through persistence, if then you've got a player who, no matter how much they persist, is still unable to proceed, that's actually against the vision for your game. And that's why you get things like that slow motion mode, like the community participation in the Souls games, all that kind of stuff, because actually that isn't what the designers intend. So looking more specifically at something like Dark Souls, it basically comes down to, again, the same point about what is a necessary barrier and what is an unnecessary barrier. And really the core thing with the Souls games, what gives you that persistence, it isn't like tricky platforming or something. It's all about the persistence that it takes to actually learn the attack patterns of the bosses, that kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that you really can't touch. If you messed with that core mechanic, you would no longer have a Souls game anymore. That's what makes the game what it is. There's tons of other barriers that are completely unnecessary. So, for example, having a red health bar against the brown background. that's going to be completely invisible to someone who's got red colour vision deficiency. It's been a while now since I thought about this, but there was something about the controls, the blocking mechanic, which involves having to hold down like two different buttons at the same time. That's the kind of thing that's completely unnecessary. If you could solve that barrier, that would make the game a ton more enjoyable for a ton more people without impacting that core experience at all. So that's the kind of things that I think you can look at.
Yeah, and as you say, and it's very tricky. Like, again, like Dark Souls, the whole Souls series in of itself. I mean, that is just a fascinating breakdown we could have right now if we had 3 to 4 hours to discuss. But
Yep.
as you said, as I'm sure everyone watching this here live recorded knows, there are just these essentially like hard elements that define the Souls series that you can't touch without really taking away or removing the element of the Souls series. As you said, if we have a mode in that game that says all bosses will now only use one attack pattern, that's it would completely, that just removes the entire vision of what it means to play. But
Yeah, you'd be left with Streets of Rage instead, right?
I know. Although Streets of Rage Bloodborne does sound pretty cool. I think let's send from Software that one.
Picture the aesthetic now.
Yeah. But here's an interesting question. I'm not sure this is going to be a long or a short one for you. But as you just said, when it comes to, as you just said with the description or the interview from the Dark Souls developer about how he had an intentional vision for these games. He wanted them to be about perseverance and the player rising up to beat these challenges and that feeling of success. My question is, doesn't that inherently create a contradiction between saying that and then the same breath wanting to tone things down or change things to make them more accommodating? Like, does that create that contradiction, or is there a way to hold those two thoughts in the same breath?
There is, by looking at it not in terms of deviating from your vision, looking at more in terms of players who don't have the experience you intended, is that being a deviation from your vision? In which case, actually offering some flexibility brings it back closer to your original vision again. So it's about getting people closer to the experience you want to have rather than deviating from your vision.
Now, we've of course, a few minutes ago, you of course mentioned the game Cuphead. And Cuphead is another game that, of course, ran into some measure of controversy, or non-controversial, however you want to say it, last year. As you said, with the simple mode. And that's another very interesting point, because I think a lot of people, and I would put myself in that group, would agree that the simple mode really isn't that great of an accessibility option. And I want to get your thoughts a little bit more. If you could clarify, like, what did you think about that kind of feature in a game like Cuphead?
Well, again, basically, it kind of went against their vision for the game, because they specifically said about Cuphead what they wanted was for it to be fair. That every single time you die, you can learn something. Next time you come back, you'll improve, you'll get better, and you eventually do it. So they really wanted as many people as possible to be able to get through the game. They didn't want to just say, like, this is a difficult game only for people who've got a really high skill level. And there's a lot of stuff, like from of these other examples, games that I've talked about, they've all got their own different approaches of tackling that kind of tension between the two things. But where Cuphead kind of fell down was that his simple mode isn't actually a simple mode at all. It's a training mode. So the fact that they have left off all those stages, and is it both stages and boss fights it leaves out? But the fact that it isn't the full experience, basically, it kind of shows that what they were thinking about was that by the time somebody has reached the end of simple mode, that they will then have all of the necessary skills and abilities to then go back and play it through on regular mode. Which obviously isn't the case. People have got very different skill ceilings. So there'll be a lot of people who playing through simple mode is really, really difficult. The pinnacle of your abilities. So then to put all that time and investment in, to be shot down at the last minute and be told actually the rest of the game is only for people who are higher skill. Well, to be told actually you're supposed to be at a high level skill level now, when you might not be able to do that, is a bit of a rough situation to be in. So you can kind of see what the designers were thinking, but I think there could have been more effective ways to do it, certainly.
Yeah, but it's always very interesting, and actually it takes me to a very interesting question I have for you, Ian. And I want to get your thoughts on games that have that, like as we've said before, when it comes to good game design, you really have to think about, again, that the intended user experience, or what I like to use the term the baseline experience of what you expect out of someone to play your game. And so far during this chat, we've talked about things on the lower end of the skill level, again, trying to make things more accommodating for new players. But there's also can be said of having a low or normal skill bar or a baseline, but then adding in additional challenges to make your game, or to have that stuff for someone who wants that harder bite without punishing people who don't. And some big examples of this, of course, would be something like, or for instance in Celeste, with the B and C side challenges. Or pick a Mario game and you can look at the bonus or special worlds. Or even games that integrate difficulty directly into the experience, such as one of my all-time favorite games, The World Ends With You, that you could play that game entirely on easy mode and get the complete experience. But if you play that game on normal, hard, expert, whatever they want to call it, you're rewarded with additional enemies, additional loot, and additional tactics. But in these cases, neither side is being forced to be accommodating for the other. Meaning if I'm a low-level player, I'm not being asked to play high-level challenges, and vice versa. So I want to get your thoughts on that. When you design the extra hard stuff as more of, the icing on the cake rather than being the entire experience.
Yeah, well, the difficulty needs to go both ways. I think a nice example of that was Bayonetta. So Bayonetta, the difficulty goes up really, really hard on the hardest difficulty setting. But it goes the other way as well. It goes all the way down to automatic mode, where, going back to the combos example, it reduces combos to a single button press. You just press the button once at the right time, it does the whole combo for you. The thing to bear in mind is that it's not so much about, like, there is a core experience and the people at the top end are deviating from it and the people at the bottom end are deviating from it. Those options are allowing everyone to not deviate from it, because you've got people, because if what you're after with that game is players to experience the reward of having, like, some big fancy flashy visuals in return for them succeeding at pushing their motor skills to the very limit, you'll have people playing at both ends of the spectrum who are experiencing that same thing, even though they're on very, very, very different settings. So I think that's an important part of it, not looking so much at it as being like there is a core experience and people deviating from it, more that it's how to what options you can provide to bring more people into the same kind of experience.
Yeah, and again, this is a topic, let me check our time here. Yeah, we're about 50 minutes in. This is a topic that we're not going to be completely getting through in the next 10 minutes, that's for sure. But if you're free in the future, I would love to have you back on. We can discuss more about this. Because again, when we start getting into the game design side of things, there's just so much we can actually begin to break down and discuss further.
Yep. Well, I'll try and sum it up concisely then. That that you can't give people the same experience ever. Everyone's experience with a game is unique, based on their own past gaming experiences, based on their past life experiences. So rather than trying to get people to conform to a particular vision, it's more about giving people equivalent experiences, identifying what kind of things you want them to feel, and recognizing that the path they may take to get that, and the individual interactions may be different, but as long as they're experiencing the same kind of emotions and stuff that you're aiming for, then I think you've done as good as you can do.
Yeah, and I think we probably have answered this one already, but just to clarify for people watching this live or recorded, again, when we talk about trying to have any discussion of accessibility in a high skill level or especially a competitive level game, again, the common criticism from the hardcore will say that you are dumbing things down. You are, robbing people of the experience. And that's another popular one. Again, I hear this whenever someone mentions it on a Dark Souls forum or a competitive game forum of saying, can we make things a little bit easier? There's people will say, no, that's not how you're supposed to play this game. You are, how's someone going to learn this game if, you're just going to give them auto assist or auto aim or, bonus options in a fighting game or anything like that. So when you hear those criticisms, Ian, like, what's your defense at that point?
Why do you care? Why does it matter to you so much what somebody else's experience is? You should be worrying about your own experience, If so, like, if you pick a book off a shelf in a bookstore, take it home and start reading it, you're not going to be going on forums on the internet ranting about how somebody might skip to the last chapter, It doesn't matter what other people's experiences are. If there's some option in the game, if somebody chooses that option, it doesn't affect your own experience at all. I've only come across, and all the thousands of people that I've spoken to, one about this exact topic, there's only actually been 2 people who, after a bit of a chat about it, really passionately believed that somebody else playing a game on a different option, some different kind of settings, some different kind of difficulty level, impacted their experience. They thought that it devalued their own experience, but that's only been literally 2 people out of thousands. Generally speaking, once people get into the bit of a nitty-gritty about it, it's not that difficult a concept to grasp, that if somebody chooses an option, it doesn't affect your own experience at all. If you're talking something like an MMO or like online multiplayer first-person shooter, something, obviously that's a bit different. But a single-player experience, why does it matter if somebody else wants to play a game in that way?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think that is certainly a really great point to begin to wrap things up on. So, one last quick time check. Yeah. So for you folks watching this live right now, I'm going to put an official last call for any questions for Ian regarding accessibility in games and game design. So please get them in the next 2 or 3 minutes, because otherwise we are going to start to wrap things up here. But while we're waiting for hopefully any questions to come in, I want to again go back to high difficulty or high skill level games, because there's one other, I guess, I'm not sure this would be considered a tangent, I want to get your thoughts on, Ian. And that is, how does a developer respond? Like, as we've said, when it comes to accessibility, just like with playtesting, it's better to do this as early in the design as possible. But what happens for what should a developer do? Like, let's say, it's the first week of release. The game is done, we're done, it's released, gone gold, all that. And people start saying, or they start wanting to demand, why can't there be easy modes? Why can't there be more accessibility options? For a developer who's in that position where, let's say they either A, completely didn't think about it, or B, they thought about it but said, we want to go for this exact core experience or this exact group of people. How do they respond at that point to people wanting them to add more features to this game or change things when we're past the 11th hour?
Be honest, be upfront, have a dialogue. Even if there's no way at all you're going to be able to implement the feature, you can have an open, frank discussion about that. Say, look, our budget's gone. We thought it's too late in the process. If you thought about the start development, it might have been feasible, but now it would take us approximately 2 months of retrofitting to work to do it. So, sadly. But that's the thing, if you actually start having that dialogue, you don't know where the conversation is going to take you. You might learn a lot about the feature that you can't do, and that'll give you a ton of really, really good knowledge to go into your next game with. So again, that was something that was seen with Uncharted 4. So like I said, the work they did in Uncharted 4 was quite a small amount of work, quite late in development. But through the process of doing that work, they become a lot more aware about the kind of stuff that can be done if it was thought about early in development. So it'd be interesting to see what future games come out of Naughty Dog are going to be like, and that's the same situation that a lot of developers in, where they've been pretty much in the same situation that you're describing, of coming to accessibility really late in development, trying to do what's possible, maybe to get a couple of features in, but have now got that initial core bit of knowledge and are going into their next games thinking, oh, if only I'd thought about it at the beginning, okay, this time I can. So I think over the next year or two, the games that are currently in development, is going to be a lot of those people who are kind of on their second generation of accessibility consideration.
And as you said earlier, with games like Cuphead, Super Meat Boy, and Dark Souls and the like, that a lot of the developers they didn't really intentionally want to make a, brutal, hardcore, soul-crushing experience for people, because ultimately you want as many people to play your game as you can, because the more people who play it can mean more sales. It can mean more fans coming down the line. And speaking of which, question from chat, Pratush, I'm sorry if I just butchered your name there, asks, what do you think about the prevention of word of mouth if the experience is homogenized? And he was referring to talking about the idea of having forced auto combos in fighting games, and how if everyone has the same exact experience, that may make it hard for people to, I guess, talk about the game or praise its unique gameplay or its varied if everyone is just doing the same exact thing.
Okay, yeah, that's. I think that's a good one to answer, because that's not what accessibility is about at all. It's not about dumbing down games or homogenizing them in any way at all. It's about respecting people's unique individual visions for their games and identifying barriers that are getting in between that vision and the players. It shouldn't be about dumbing down games at all. If you do that, it's kind of the opposite of accessibility. Because if you take that core thing that makes the game unique and original and fun, and in some way break that, you're taking that fun and making it inaccessible to 100% of the players. That's the opposite of accessibility. Accessibility is about identifying that mechanic, preserving it, and making sure that as many people as possible can access that.
And again, there's a lot more we can certainly discuss, and it's a topic that I think it continues to grow, I think, more and more over the years, or as years go on. So I guess I have two final questions for you, Ian, and then I think that will be it for me. So this first one, this could probably be its own topic and maybe even be too big to answer right now. But one of the more interesting discussions we've had regarding making games more inclusive to people is having more gender options. Not just having a straight white male as a default, having gender, male, female, and even more options for players wanting to customize characters. Do you view that in the same category as accessibility for game design?
No, I don't. That's something quite different. You can see that just by comparing like for like with disability. So the equivalent of gender options isn't accessibility. The equivalent of gender options is having disability options. It's about representation. That's quite a different thing to accessibility.
All right.
I've seen some interesting discussion on the difference between the two as well. On the when you get a representation of people within a game, but that game is not accessible to those people who are being represented. So, for example, if you've got a game that's got a blind protagonist that's inaccessible to people who are blind, so there's quite a big difference between representation and accessibility in that sense, certainly. But representation of people with disabilities in games is something that is hugely underrepresented. You could easily, even if you spend a lot of time thinking about it, protagonists in games, you'd be struggling to fill fingers on two hands. And then if you look at the percentage of the population that are affected, then it's really massively underrepresented. And that's actually something that came out in the UK. The government ran a think tank kind of workshop with young people with disabilities, asking them about what kind of barriers were facing in their lives, what kind of the most pressing issues were, and the lack of representation of people with disabilities in video games, so lack of disabled characters in video games, was the number one most pressing concern they had in their whole lives.
And that, like you say, and that is another topic we could easily jump into.
Another topic, yeah.
And yeah, I do have some thoughts on that, especially with what I just wrote on Gamma Sutra about serious topics and storytelling. But that will probably add another 30 minutes, an hour to this easily. So we may have to save that for another time. But here's my last question for you, and I think this will be a great one to kind of wrap up our chat for today. And that is, in your opinion, do you see accessibility improving in the game industry in terms of developers being more conscientious of it, of seeing it become more of a standard acceptance for games? Like, how has things grown since you first started looking at accessibility, and where are we at right now?
I'd say, yeah. So I got started just over 10 years ago, and it's changed astronomically beyond all recognition in that time. I mean, just some of the stuff. I mean, both at game level, not just at game level, yeah, but at platform level as well. This year we hit the point where every single major gaming platform. So by that I mean iOS, Android, Windows, Xbox, PS4, and the Switch. They all have built-in features designed specifically for people with disabilities. Even going back like 3-4 years ago, the idea that a console would have any kind of accessibility feature in it was just pure science fiction. But now, though, if you just take the Xbox for example, there's its system interface has got text to speech for people who are blind, so they can navigate the interface. It has zoom, high contrast, system level remapping. That's not a substitute for doing it in games, by the way. It's just there as a safety net. It has mono toggle. It has so people who are like deaf and one ear to play both the channels simultaneously. It has co-pilot mode, which is really, really cool. You can basically plug in a second controller and have that act the same way as the first controller. So for example, if you've got one hand, you can use the left hand side of one controller in your hand and use the right hand side of a second controller with your foot. There's two-way text-to-speech live transcription API. So in a multiplayer game, you can have text and voice transcribing between themselves in real time. So someone who is deaf can speak with somebody who's not, and like all that kind of stuff on the platform side. Like I said, there's tons of cool stuff going on, and a few years ago it would have been unimaginable. On the game side as well, the even again going back a few years ago, you only have to go back to about 2014 and color blindness, which is something that is a very common consideration now. Wasn't thought about. It wasn't until you had Borderlands 2 and SimCity and Black Ops 2 all patching colorblind modes around that kind of time in 2014. That's what really set the ball rolling, and awareness began to raise as a result of these big games doing it. Before then, it was really, really rare. So all this kind of stuff is progressing really, really quickly, and it's interesting seeing games that are in development now as well, especially from the influence of things like all the press that Uncharted got for its accessibility settings. There's a lot of games now which are doing a ton of good stuff, but they're not out yet because of development life cycles. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see what kind of position the industry is in a couple of years' time, especially even just in terms of my own work. Going back a few years ago, it was more like helping out with the design of an individual accessibility feature, or doing review and an audit of accessibility for a specific game. Now, a lot of the work I'm doing is working with people on like workflow and process and internal guidelines and that kind of stuff. So it's progressing a lot really quickly. It's still a long, long way from where it needs to go. It's still quite low on the graph, but that graph is an exponential curve. So the difference in how much progress is being made is increasing more and more every year.
Right. Good to hear, and I think that is a great high note to end our little chat for tonight on, Ian. So we are going...
looking very bright.
Yes, it is. So thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me tonight, Ian. And definitely the best of luck with your work in the future. Are you working on anything now or coming up that you want to talk about or tease, or is it still, hush hush at the moment?
Yeah, all of the client work that I do is always under heavy NDA, so I can't really talk about that, unfortunately. But I guess something that I'm doing outside of that is a gaming accessibility conference which we started up last year, and the second edition of that is going to be coming around in 4 weeks' time on March the 19th. So that's going to be in San Francisco. If anyone can make it there, it would be lovely to see you there. If not, all the sessions are being recorded. And you can actually go and have a look at last year's sessions as well if you go to gaconf.com. If you have a look down the bottom right hand side, there's a link to a YouTube playlist which has got all of last year's talks in. There's loads of really cool stuff in, including a talk from Naughty Dog, which is where some of that stuff like that 30% figure comes from as well.
Great. Alright, so with that said, for you folks watching this live or recorded, we are going to end things right here. If you're watching this recorded and would like to get access to an ad-free version of our talk early, be sure to check out patreon.com/JoshBycer, and supporting us will get you access to that. Before we end things tonight, Ian, if people want to follow you and your work, do you have any places for them to check out?
Yep, Twitter. Yeah, it's at Ian Hamilton _. So that's the best place. And if you ever want to chat as well, just hit me up. I'll happily talk your ear off for longer than the hour restriction we had here as well. So yeah, hit me up if you want to chat about anything accessibility related.
Alright, so I think that is going to do it. And again, we could probably sit here and talk for another hour, but I know you have to get going for dinner. I should probably eat something as well before we both just collapse our keyboards. So if you wouldn't mind hanging on Skype for like 30 seconds after we end the cast, I just have a few post-cast questions for you. So with all that said, once again, thank you for tuning in to this week's Perceptive podcast. For you folks watching this live, I should be back on later tonight with some regular game streaming. But otherwise, check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. So, until our next chat, have a great night, folks. And again, Ian, hopefully we can talk again real soon.
Indeed. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. All right. Until next time, take care, everybody.